I do think that there's been a changing, at least for me, of like what advanced means. And it has become more gentle for me. And gentle doesn't necessarily mean like you wouldn't have a vigorous practice, even in a sense. For me, it has more to do with purpose. Like we're saying, is the practice that you're doing really serving you on that fundamental level? And if doing like a more vigorous practice is really a loving of yourself, great, but I think for me, as sort of cheesy as it sounds, I really needed to find a way to do that. And practice was where I did that, to really genuinely have compassion for myself, to love myself and forgive myself. And that became, from the intimacy there, is where I've been able to have my relationships be what I want them to be, and enabled me to be more the person I want to be and the dad I want to be.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Szabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. I'm excited about our guest today, in particular because he does a lot of the same things that I do, and that is he is a yoga teacher. He's also a writer and the host of another popular yoga podcast called Yoga Talks. He's here today to talk to us about yoga in the modern world and this practice that we're doing so much in the West. Jay Brown, welcome to the show.
Hey, man, thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be here with you.
So I'd like to start, and if you could, give us a little bit of your background, in particular, the story of how you got into yoga in the first place.
Well, I started going to yoga classes. Well, the first yoga class I ever took was in college. I went to NYU to study acting, and in that program, there was a yoga class. And at that time, I was in not such a good place. My mom had passed away of leukemia when I was 16 years old. And at the time when she passed away, I really was not in any kind of place to deal with that or be present with that emotionally. So it came home to roost a couple years later when I was in school. And it was pretty much sort of at a worse time in my life. And yoga was a glimmer of something. Like it, even at my worst, at my most angst and depressed, I couldn't deny that I felt a little better after a yoga class. And ultimately, when I got out of school, it really hit hard, where I got to a place where really I felt like either I have to kill myself or I have to find another way to live. Like what I was doing wasn't working. And when I hit that moment, the killing myself wasn't really an option because of this promise I had made to my mom on her deathbed. And it was I don't know exactly how to explain that promise or how that promise came about. But, when my mom was sick, I was really not visiting her at the hospital at all for a good several months. And it was only when they weren't sure she was going to make it through the night that they rushed me to the hospital. And she was coming in and out of consciousness. And I remember the nurse coming in and saying, she's awake, and then being rushed into the room. And she was in a very chaotic state. And she was saying things like, I'm not ready to go. And my sister was bawling and holding on to her. And in that moment, at age 16, I was a very hyper kid. I hadn't shown any signs of any kind of clarity or groundedness, or I was a very hyper kid. And in that moment, standing there, something happened that I can't totally explain, but some kind of calm came over me. And I went to my mother and I held her and stopped her from being all over. And she looked straight at me, and I said, I'm going to do great things in my life, and I'm going to make you proud of me. And I'm not going to come see you in the hospital again. And she, a tear fell, and I kissed her, and I left the room. And that was the last time I saw or spoke to her. And And when I was in that moment, when I had to, I was considering, like, I don't know if I want to live anymore, like that promise became an override where it wasn't like I couldn't do that. Like I had to find another way to live. And one of the only things I could think to do was go to a yoga class, which I started doing quite religiously.
Why is it that, do you feel that you couldn't see your mother, or you told her that you weren't coming back again? Because I find that compelling. I've never had loss in my own life so immediate and so close. I mean, I've lost people in my life, but nothing to the extent that. So I can't even really fathom of like, how would I really interact in that situation? And when I was originally reading that story, I was fascinated by that, just because, I was wondering, as you mentioned, on your website when you're talking about it, of, the yoga helping you process the sorrow and the grief from your mom. I was just wondering if that was, a big part. Like, do you regret not seeing your mom more in the hospital?
I don't regret it, because it's just what I was capable of. Mm-hmm. And actually, I don't know that seeing her in I guess I have not a regret, but I wish I could have known her more. But I wish I could have known her more now, like as an adult, where I have more depth as a, in person. Like, I've mentioned this recently. Like, I wrote like this essay to like get into college when I was 18, and it was about my mom dying, but like I can't even read it because it's such a superficial, like it almost sounds like I'm using it as like a thing on a resume to get a job. Because I just didn't, like, it hurts me to read it because I just didn't have like an emotional depth, at that time in my life. So I don't regret not seeing her in the hospital, and saying to her that I'm not going to come see you again. In the moment, I think some part of me knew I wasn't going to see her again. And I think also I knew I hadn't been able to see her in the hospital. In those months leading up, nobody was forcing me to go. I remember trying to go once, and I have this memory of sitting in the parking lot of my car for like a half hour, and I didn't go in. Like, I just couldn't do it. And I knew I wasn't going to be able to. So I needed her to know.
Yeah.
But absolutely, for me, reconciling that loss has absolutely become like the overriding sort of motivation or sort of impetus for my yoga practice, and why I'm so passionate about yoga practice, because I feel that I was able to reconcile it through practice.
How do you feel that the practice did that for you? Is it some, mystical, magical element of the practice? Is it the self-reflection? Is it moving energy through the body? For you, what do you feel, how do you feel that the practice really helped you to process and integrate the emotions that you were feeling, specifically around your mom, but we could even say life in general?
Well, I think after my mom passed, I just felt like something was wrong with me, like something had been broken. I felt very disenchanted with life in general. Like, I remember writing on this paper, there's no hope. Like I didn't feel any hope in life at all. And I think originally, it's interesting because I know you're somebody who's interested in yoga philosophy. So initially I was practicing within some traditions that were of a more, I think, kind of dualistic quality. And so for me, like, following the 8 limbs meant I was going to somehow be able to transcend all this pain I was in.
Absolutely.
Like, I wanted to sort of reach a place in my consciousness where I could be beyond this deep suffering that I had in me. This grief that just seemed like unquenchable. There's no way to get to the bottom of it ever. Even to this day, it's not like, even talking to you right now, it's not like that's not still there just as much as it ever was.
Well, and that's that kind of the yoga platitude. We're like, oh, I let go of my anger, or I let go of my grief. It's like, really? Like, where did it go? Like, let go of your arm. Let me see how that works out for you. It's still there.
Whatever that experience was that brought about that anger or grief, that doesn't go away. You've had that experience.
Yeah.
So, for a while, that was what it was about for me. But that did that did become a bit of a trap, trying to utilize yoga practice to transcend out of this suffering, like I was going to hit some sort of enlightenment consciousness that would make me beyond it. That then became also a thing that I had to address. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, I did find my way to like a more tantric, non-dual viewpoint where I began to embrace the idea that, oh, there's nothing wrong with me. Like this pain in me, this difficulty, like we're just talking about, that's not an indication that there's something wrong with me or that I'm lacking. It's just that I'm a human. And part of being a human means those experiences. And actually, in a way, like this experience that happened to me with my mom, it kind of gave me something so incredible and important where like even back then, even when I was messed up, like I was no longer like interested in skating around on the surface. Like when someone's that you care about is passing, or when you have to deal with deep tragedy. And I think this happens with a lot of yoga teachers that I've spoken with, where a lot of times what's given them what they're offering has to do with overcoming a deep tragedy they experienced.
Mm-hmm. Well, and would you also say, given your experience as a teacher, that a lot of people go similarly to, as you spoke of they go to yoga because they're trying to get past something, get over something, like improve themselves beyond a certain point. And then, at first there is a lot of shift and change physically, emotionally, and there's stuff happening. But I feel like when people are in the practice long enough, they get to a point where the practice isn't about getting to some place. It's not about suppressing emotions or feelings, but rather embracing the experience of. I think there's a natural evolution from the more dualistic classical view to a more affirming tantric view. Would you say that's your experience too with your students? And I mean, obviously it's been part of your own journey, but...
Well, it's certainly been a part of my journey. And, I actually remember the moment when that kind of hit me. There was this class I was in, and I was asked to do a handstand demonstration. And it was like a handstand press in the middle of the room. And I did my demonstration, and then everybody clapped. And the teacher said, that's what we're working towards. And like right in the moment, I felt real good about myself. But on the way home, I felt miserable, because while I had accomplished a lot, like you said, like I had gotten some sort of discipline, and I was able to like have more say about what I was doing. And I certainly could do some pretty cool things with my body, but I was still deeply unresolved and in lots of pain. And I remember thinking, oh gosh, if this is what we're working towards, we're totally screwed. Like there's gotta be more to it than this. Mm-hmm. And I think that's when I became more interested in philosophy. But to go to your question in terms of the evolution, like I certainly took that approach to a point where it no longer worked for me, and then discovered other teachings. But I also like to fancy sometimes that I save people a bit of trouble, maybe. Like I'd like to think that if someone had presented me with some other ideas to begin with, I might have been open to them. I might not have, I might have needed that first. Maybe there is for some people, like you need to do that first. And maybe you never go to maybe they don't ever have to be non-dual and tantric. Maybe that's a perfectly fine path for a lot of people,
Yeah. Well, I think that's absolutely a valid point, because some people like, I truly believe like the monastic path or renunciate path, any of that is a totally valid path. But, to me, and I was on it as well. I mean, I literally thought I was going to be a monk, and I had a cave picked out and the whole spiel. But it kind of came to that point for me that I was running away from the difficulties and challenges instead of learning how to integrate them. And there was that little voice in me, maybe it was my old martial arts teacher or whatever, just being like, that's the easy way out, like challenging me to be in the world. And a lot of my work with plant medicine as well, I was getting similar messages of like, you are actually running away. This isn't like, oh, let me just sit so I can reach enlightenment. It's let me sit because actually standing and being in the world is a lot harder. So how to integrate that and how to be a part of that without neglecting whole sides of ourselves has been a big part of my own journey and my own challenge for sure.
Oh, I had the same experience. I remember I had a period of time where I was doing these very long seated meditations every morning, maybe 45 minutes. And they were wonderful. They were beautiful. There was so much wonderful things happening in there. But my life outside of that was a real mess. and he didn't have good relationships. And I remember going to my teacher and sort of telling him everything I was doing and doing all my practices, and still I'm so lonely. And he said, "Oh man, Jay, you got to stop meditating and go get a girlfriend." And, I did that, and now she's my wife and we have 2 children. And so what you said was really the same for me. Like, in a way, having a blissful experience in a seated meditation and that not translating into my relationships, into my life, was actually not helping me. It was like actually making my life worse. Like, whatever we do in practice, it needs to integrate. And I guess that is what the tantric teachings say. Like, it's all about integration.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there was this great quote posted by on Ram Dass's social media the other day or something. It said, "Just because you're seeing the divine light, experiencing waves of bliss, or conversing with gods and goddesses, it's no reason not to know your zip code." It's like, you got to be in the world still. Like, even if you're doing all this sort of, you're having all these profound experiences, if your relationships are a mess, if the way that you interact with the world is a mess, then all of that stuff doesn't really matter, or at least to me. I mean, I guess I can value the skill involved and the discipline involved for people that can just, commit their entire lives all day and night to monastic life and practice. But truly, like, if we don't, and that's something I've noticed a lot, like, you've got advanced meditators, but their personal lives are a mess. So it's like, well, then, what's the point at that point? I mean, I guess if you're looking to get up and out and you're on a more vertical path, then that still is the point, and that's okay. But for a more vertical or tantric path, there's definitely that, like, okay, well, let's have those experiences, but how do we integrate them in? And you mentioned being a father too, and I'm curious, just as another father to father and yoga teacher, yogi, lots of labels just thrown out there, but
sure.
How has being a father changed your practice, and how has it changed you as a teacher?
I don't know. I mean, I think that being a father has changed my practice, in just that I don't have as much time and energy to do physical practice as I once did. Like, being like an asana guy for a long time and really having like a love for the forms, it's sort of hard to accept at a certain point that it doesn't make sense for me to put my body through the same things that I once did. That what I did for my body in the past, while it served me then, and if I do that now, it will exhaust me or injure me, because I just have so much more of me that has to go to other things besides just teaching and my relationship to my wife. Now I have like 2 children. So there's a lot of parenting, and you're a dad. So especially those first 2 years, it's like triage, and so you have a lot of sacrifice you have to make, and more practice would be depleting. So on my own personal practice, it had to become, I hate to use the word, but it had to become more integrated, where I do 10 minutes here or 5 minutes there. It's not necessarily a big 90-minute practice like it might have been in the past.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think too, when we recognize what postures are, in essence, vehicles and opportunities, then we recognize that a posture is also the way that I'm interacting with my wife, with my daughter. Like, that becomes the pose. Like, how can I skillfully navigate that experience in relationship? So on the mat, maybe it's the relationship to the body, maybe it's the relationship to the breath. Maybe those things exist still out in the world, obviously, but it also adds the element of, okay, now how are those things, and how is my mind relating to what this person is saying to me, or what this person is doing to me, or my child needs her diaper changed, and how am I integrating and dealing with that? Not that my daughter still wears diaper, but
I hear you. Oh, how old is your daughter?
She's 5 now.
All right, so you're getting to that point where they start to really take on their own person.
Oh yeah, it's super fun right now. It's a blast.
I totally hear what you're saying in terms of the children, and in terms of my own personal practice, that like the forms in a way have become almost irrelevant, in a sense that my practice is about getting my mind in a more directable state. because that's where I'm able to actually do all these things that I need to do in the way that I want to do them, you know? So it's not so important for me to like, again, challenge myself with new forms. It's more about how those forms are going to affect me in my internal state and kind of give me what I need to get through that day.
When you went from a really heavy Ashtanga practice to now where, I mean, you're all about going slow, correct? Like it's much more breath-centered practice, taking your time.
Well, I think that happened largely first because I had a couple of bad injuries. Like I blew out a knee, and I think ultimately I met this Swami in India actually, who I spent like 10 days with, who he really turned things around for me. He was, I think, the guy who really pointed me in the tantric direction. He didn't have great English, so it was really through like kind of a communication where first he would ask me if I knew how to do something like, say, Dhanurasana, and I would do like this big, flashy New York, put my feet on my head version. And I remember his response was, yes, children also do very well. like he was totally unimpressed by the displays that were giving me the applause and considered advanced in New York. And ultimately, the question he kept asking me, we would like do a simple thing that seemed very boring to me. And he would say, okay, tell me now, how do you feel? And at that time, for the first couple of days, I would just blabber on. Like, I'm sure you know this, where like you're in a yoga class with a young teacher who's really trying their darndest to sound smart. And maybe they're talking out their butt a little bit to do so. Well, I was definitely doing that. And he would get really annoyed and say, let's try something else. And then eventually I thought he was a fraud. And I came in one morning with a chip on my shoulder, and he asked me again, how do you feel? And I kind of snapped at him and I said, I don't know how I feel. And he smiled really big and he said, good. Because he'd been asking me the question for so long, you know, how do you feel? How do you feel? And I'd been talking about a lot of stuff and trying to display all my knowledge and my abilities. But the truth was, I had no idea how I felt. And it hit me like a bucket of water. And that became like the directive from there on out. Like, okay, how does this make me feel? And how does this play into how I feel in general? And I kind of gave myself permission. Like, I'm just not going to do things that I don't understand why I'm doing them anymore. And I started dropping things out, and I started doing only self-practice to sort that out. And that's when I did come in contact with that book, Heart of Yoga by T.K. Vidyasekachar. And that book really connected to me for what the Swami was saying to me. And then I met the guy who edited the original version of that, Mark Whitwell, and he was a teacher of mine, and he really clued me into a lot of stuff. And that's really solidified what I had been discovering in my own personal practice, which, as you said, is that it just became much more breath-centered, specifically Ujjayi Pranayama-centered. And that really changed it and led to what I do now, which is, like you say, it is a vinyasa practice, but it's much slower and simpler and breath-centered, and it has a therapeutic orientation in a way that my practice didn't in the past. What I would say is I've taken the teachings of Desikachar combined with some philosophy stuff from U.G. Krishnamurti, if any of your listeners know who he is, and I've put that into like a sort of conventional New York vinyasa yoga class context. Because that's my teacher say. He said, you need to take this and put it into what you're already doing. I was already making a living as a power vinyasa teacher. And I remember the second bucket of water was when I was doing a totally different practice at home that was really working for me, but I was still teaching power vinyasa, and that's how I was paying my rent. And I was really having a hard time of that. And Mark said to me, hey man, if you don't teach what you're doing at home in your class, you're a fraud. And I was like, darn, he's so right. So I really just made a switch. And originally, a lot of people weren't into it. I had a reputation for being a very kick-ass vinyasa teacher. And a lot of people wanted that. And then I wasn't doing that anymore. And they left, which I totally respect. But then a lot of other people came in. And then over time, I became known as the breath guy. And anybody who had like injuries or wasn't interested in a very fast-paced vinyasa, they would send to me.
Do you think that that process of moving from that very hard, more aggressive style to a softer one is a natural evolution? Like, do you think that all of yoga, because yoga in the West is still very much in its infancy, right? Like it's our culture's adaptation of this practice, or we could say a large body of practices from another culture entirely, and kind of how we're adapting to it and how we've adapted to it really the most is with the physical strong side of it, and we haven't really integrated culturally yet a lot of the other elements. Do you think that that's kind of a natural progression that it's going to move towards from the hard style to a much slower, softer style? Or do you think both are always going to be there? Or what's your opinion on kind of where you think yoga is going to be going here in the West?
Well, thank you for the question. For me, I made that switch a long while back. And at that time, I was mostly considered a hater. Like, I felt like I was pushing back against a huge wave of like a power vinyasa craze. It's really what made yoga profitable for the gyms. And, then over time that has shifted, with William J. Broad's article and all the new conversations and a fall of a lot of the guru figureheads. And, now I'm out there with my gentle is the new advanced. And there's just a whole bunch of people singing the same song in a way that I never have seen before. And, my theory is just that over time, enough people have practiced for enough years, like you and me, where at a certain point we've had to kind of question and acknowledge what's changed for us. And, I like to think that there's an overall change happening. But I also, don't want to, again, I'm always hesitant to make broad sweeping statements about it. But I do think that enough people have come to yoga and know enough about it that they're being more discerning. Like, I remember being at a party even just 10 years ago, maybe, and telling someone I was a yoga teacher and them saying, "What's that?" But now if I'm at a party and I say I'm a yoga teacher, they'll say, "Oh, well, what kind of yoga do you teach?" So I think people know there's more options. And I do think that some of the harder schools are changing. Like, I just had a podcast with Eddie Stern, and he said even in the Ashtanga school, even Sharat, the lineage holder of Ashtanga yoga, has softened, that they're no longer doing the hard assists, and they're telling people not to push so hard, and they're becoming more forgiving and letting people choose to rest. And so I do think that there's a big shift happening, and I do think it's a good progression. It certainly was a healthy progression for me, so it would make sense to me that it'd be a healthy progression for like the broader yoga world too.
Mm-hmm. Well, in talking about some of the influence both in and of the West on yoga, we're both podcasters, we both have online courses, things like that. Where do you see technology or what kind of role do you see technology playing in yoga's evolution, whether we're talking specifically in the West or in the world as a whole? But how do you think that this rise of technology plays into the natural process of evolution of the practice of yoga? Not necessarily for one individual, but kind of as a whole, where does technology fit in?
Well, that's a good question too. I had to just embrace it as it came aboard. I remember starting out with like a newsletter, and then that turning into WordPress blogs, and then all the social media hit. And you kind of have to do it if you want to. And you and I both have video stuff, and I originally was very resistant to it, but I've had very positive experiences, people who don't have access and are still able to learn. Mm-hmm. So, the technology, I think, it is such a mixed bag. For a while, I really embraced it and was really excited about it. But I do think it's changed over time. And now I'm like into Douglas Rushkoff. I don't know if you know him. And he wrote this great book, Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus. It has to do with just the way things have changed. And sometimes there is a value extraction more than an addition. And I do think that things are changing a little bit. where our use of these technologies is going to change. But in terms of yoga practice, I mean, I see it two different ways. In terms of practice, I do think it's helping people actually have access to things that they wouldn't have. And I think that's a positive overall. And I think the technology has really, in a way, I don't know, enabled yoga and yoga teachers to do things that we could never do before. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I also just have concerns in general, just personally. Like, I just did a podcast intro. I know you could appreciate this, where I'm just like admitting to my own screen addiction, where like, I'm on my phone and my computer, like in a way that doesn't seem healthy to me always. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to draw the line because so much of my work is at the computer now, writing and doing podcast stuff, and you make your own hours. So to try to draw the line with the screens, I think, is something we're really going to have to reconcile with.
Mm-hmm. But do you think that's more of a overall cultural concern than necessarily, I mean, I guess that's an opportunity there as a practice of yoga to really look at that stuff. But I see that too, less of an issue with yoga and more of an issue culturally. I know that, since being back in the United States, I never had a smartphone when I lived abroad. I never had an iPad. I did have my laptop, which I did use. But I mean, it wasn't like, as you say, like now that I've got my iPad and my smartphone and my this and my that, there's always seems to be a screen in front of me. In our world, one of the advantages of, I mean, I lived on this little island in Thailand, and the technology allowed me to connect and get access to yoga teachers that I simply wouldn't have had on that little island, which was great. It let me stay connected to friends and family across the world, which was awesome. But now I get back here and it's like, it's a hyper connection, and it's very surface based. It's like, okay, well, I'm getting to see pictures of your life, but it's not like we're really sitting down and connecting one-on-one. So I do feel that struggle for sure of like, okay, well, where's the healthy balance for this? Because in when I was living abroad, I felt there was a balance with it, because I was able to use the technology in a really affirming, positive way that kept me connected to things. And it wasn't a drag, but I would have to agree with you in that, like, I feel now that it's a bit of a drag. Like, I'm definitely personally on it too much, but I also, because of all my work and everything else, I can't do the like, all right, I'm going to do a social media fast for a month and turn like, well, I mean, I could do that, but it probably wouldn't serve me, because so much of the way that I make a living now is online. So it's a very interesting dynamic. I think a lot of people struggle with that as well.
I agree. And I do think it's cultural, but I also think that those Asian countries, they're going to do that. They're on their way there too.
Yeah.
And I agree that it seems so interesting. Like, there is a little bit of a myth about connection via the internet. Like, I do think that there's connections that can be made, and I connect to a lot of people I would never connect to otherwise, but it doesn't replace like other kinds of connections, like going to have a class and have actual people show up, and those are not, you can't have that on the internet. And in a way, the internet isn't actually that good at bringing that about always.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was like the crazy phases. There's the Pokemon thing recently, and a few other things where at least it's trying to get people out in actual physical places together. But of course, they're doing it by like having their head buried in a phone.
I know. And now we're going to have the VR, which that's a whole other thing.
Oh yeah. People getting, I remember growing up and like, cause there's been a few attempts at VR in the past, and like the idea of that. I mean, I was into, role playing games and stuff as a kid, especially pre-internet with mudding and things like that. And it was, it's a whole world that you can immerse yourself into. And I mean, gosh, I got out of high school early. I worked in the video game industry, and that was it was a great thing, but it was also probably one of the worst things for me, in that I was already really introverted. So it was like, oh, cool, I get to completely lose myself in video games, and I never have to interact with the world. This is great, and I get paid to do it. This is awesome. But it definitely didn't serve me, because it got me completely lost and disconnected, because technology even though it's like you might be talking with people online and interacting, it, like as you said, it's just not the same as in-person connection, which I think is so vital, and a lot of people are starved from in our modern culture, especially in cities. I mean, going from a place where I lived on a little island, everybody, if you saw somebody walking across the street, not only did you acknowledge them and say hi, you probably had like a half-hour conversation with them at least. Try doing that in New York City, or I lived in San Diego just prior to this, or I grew up in LA. I mean, you would never get anywhere if you did that. So people just keep their heads down.
But it's like a 2-minute conversation.
Right.
Not like a half hour.
Oh, I don't know, man. I'm walking down the street even in San Diego, which is a friendly place. And I mean, people often don't want to make eye contact because, then we have to interact and exchange some type of acknowledgement with another human being. And that takes time. And who's got time? Because I got somewhere to be. I got things to do. I definitely noticed that difference in how people interact in cities versus, more rural areas. Or
I think that's true to some degree. And I also appreciate what you said about how when you were in Thailand and you had some access to it, but it felt more balanced. Mm-hmm. Like it felt like it wasn't as overriding, that there was all this other time where you were walking around and actually interacting with people. I really do think that's what Douglas Rushkoff's pointing to, is that, okay, folks, now that we've got this thing and we're all utilizing it, maybe we should really consider how we're utilizing it. And maybe there's better ways to utilize it that are going to be better in our lives, Mm-hmm. And I think that is a yoga. To me, like what we're talking about is absolutely an application of my yoga practice. It's like sorting out my use of screens goes into like kind of everything, like how I'm experiencing the world and perceiving, and the time spent in that interaction, which is our work. We do that as teachers. I think that's our job in a way. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting how much of what I do now, like you said, is not actually the act of practicing and teaching, like the actual moving and breathing exercises. It's all this other stuff that now the profession kind of dictates.
Well, I think there's a really big moment in everyone's personal journey of with yoga when we shift from that idea that this particular thing is yoga. And I mean that people love to do that, especially with the physical practice. You've got traditional. It's like, well, that's not real yoga. Real yoga is this thing over here. It's meditation. It's this or it's that. But I think there's a really profound shift when we recognize that what makes the yoga is beyond the physical postures, it's beyond the breath technique, it's beyond any of the technique, which means truly that any life experience can become a yogic technique. It can become a yogic practice if you're recognizing what the practice actually is. And that's where you say, we're like, hey, how am I interacting with my technology? That becomes a yoga practice. How am I relating to my wife, my children, my friends? That becomes a yoga practice. Everything that we do becomes that opportunity of, okay, I'm in my body, I'm in my seat, my asana. So now how am I practicing while in that particular posture? And that's when it really, to me anyways, and what I see with students as well, when it starts to work on everything in their life. Because when yoga stays on the mat, it's building up all this energy in people, but if it hasn't been integrated off the mat, it kind of just makes people more into their own psychoses and crap. So if they were kind of a jerk before, they kind of become a bigger jerk. Maybe if they were nicer before, maybe they become nicer. But it's like, it doesn't really shift into their lives until they recognize that the practice is not what they're doing right now, but something larger than that, in which case everything can be that. Do you agree with that?
I completely agree with that. And I do think that's what we were talking about before when we were talking about that is a tantric viewpoint, and that is the hallmark of it, that it is about the integration of whatever practice we do. There's not, like you said, an upward, outward trajectory, but we go inward and then back out to here, And that, I think, is the difference. That was the shift for me. And what I also want to add to that, for me personally, is that part of that shift also had to do with the viewpoint of life being more like a nurturing force to me. Mm-hmm. Like I said earlier, that I saw life as this unforgiving thing. And when my practice shifted, that was the big shift for my perspective, or my way of perceiving, was that I then saw life as, this is a nurturing force around me. And I don't have to torture my body. I want to nurture my body. I want to just relax enough to be here and enjoy this. I no longer want to get out of it anymore.
Yeah. Well, I think too, if you're
reconciling of my mom's death, that was it. Where it became a blessing that she passed.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so long as we're trying to kind of get up and out, then it doesn't really matter that we're beating up the body because we're trying to get past it anyways. But the moment...
If you think there's something wrong with you, torturing your body makes perfect sense.
Yeah, exactly.
It feels like the right thing to do. And you can find traditions that encourage it.
Absolutely.
So, but when you embrace, like I said, the notion that, there's nothing wrong with me, then it no longer makes sense. It kind of feels like a dumb thing to do.
Totally. Well, and it's important too, I think, just to kind of recognize of like the effects of accepting life as it is, that, and when we're talking about spirituality and things like that, like one is not more or less divine because they're doing these hard practices or more nurturing practices. But I think there's this recognition that's like, okay, well, if I'm accepting life as it is, then I just prefer like a more nurturing, loving environment. Like I don't need it. It isn't more holy or spiritual. But if I'm going to be in a human body, it's kind of nicer to be healthy and, not injured. And, like it kind of creates this, when we make a virtue out of deprivation, which I think sometimes a lot of that was kind of the big process of Buddha, right? He's trying all these super ascetic practices. And then he's like, you know what? I'm actually going to eat some food and that's okay. When before all of his teachers were like, no, you have to fast, you have to do this. And it's like, it doesn't mean live for material comfort or anything like that, but like a simple recognition, like, hey, you know what? It's okay to be healthy in my body and to take care of it and to nurture it. And I don't have to be beating it up all the time. So I think that's great. And I hope people, wherever they are in their journey, kind of recognize that as well. They're like, hey, you can do the hard practices or you can do soft practices, but truly find what's going to work for you the best. And I know for me, after a while and as my body matured, I could say like, I love movement. I love challenging dynamic movement, but still my physical practice is nothing what it was 15 years ago. It's much more gentle comparatively to that. And 15 years ago, I was also lifting weights and doing everything else, which was a lot of beating up of the body. So,
well, that's where my slogan, gentle is the new advanced, comes from a bit, where I do think that there's been a changing, at least for me, of like what advanced means. Mm-hmm. And it has become more gentle for me. And gentle doesn't necessarily mean like you wouldn't have a vigorous practice, even in a sense. For me, it has more to do with purpose. Like we're saying, is the practice that you're doing really serving you on that fundamental level? And if doing like a more vigorous practice is really a loving of yourself, great. But I think for me, it's sort of cheesy as it sounds, I really needed to find a way to do that. And practice was where I did that, to really genuinely have compassion for myself, to love myself and forgive myself. And that became, from the intimacy there, is where I've been able to have my relationships be what I want them to be, and enables me to be more the person I want to be and the dad I want to be. Mm-hmm.
I love it. I'm really enjoying our chat, Jay, but respecting time and all of that sort of stuff. So I wanna check in and just see, where can people find out more about you? I know you have a yoga center in Brooklyn, correct? And you've got a website, you've got online courses. If you could tell our listeners on ways they can get a hold of you and connect with you.
Well, you can find everything that I'm doing at jbrownyoga.com. And I have a monthly blog post that's pretty well read. And then I have a podcast too. And you'll have to come on my podcast, man.
Yeah, I love that.
And I love doing that. That's kind of my newest project. And I really enjoy that. I do have some video offerings, which you can find through there. That's at jbrownyogavideo.com. And I have a DVD and some downloads that are for like developing a home practice. And then I also have an online course that's like a 12-hour thing for people who want to know more about the approach that I'm offering.
Awesome.
And I do have a yoga center here in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, called Abhyasa Yoga Center. And I'm there most of the time, 5 days a week. And I'm doing a little bit of traveling too. All that stuff, though, can be found at jbrownyoga.com.
And that's J, the letter, not not Jay, correct?
No, yeah, Jay Brown. And people often ask me, and sometimes think my name is James Brown, and think I don't want everybody to think I'm James Brown. Actually, my name is Jason Brown, but anybody who lives in New York knows there's another quite respected yoga teacher named Jason Brown also, and he goes by Jason Ray Brown. So I've been going by J. Brown for a lot of years.
Nice. Well, awesome. Well, I hope people go out and check out your podcast, check out your website and your offerings, because I know sometimes you're known as a controversial guy. Sometimes you like to stir the pot a little bit, which I definitely appreciate, that kind of low-key energy of like, hey, all right, let's Loki as in the Norse the Norse god, not as in low key.
Oh no, I know what you're talking about, and I do appreciate that. I like to have a conversation going on, and sometimes out there things can get pretty glossy. And so I think sometimes I want to push back against that a little bit and see if we can really get to like the kind of conversation we had today, which I appreciate so much.
Yeah, well, I think that's kind of how we grow, and how we all push the needle forward, is sometimes challenging the boundaries of the conversations and what we kind of take for granted. Or, there's a lot of foo-foo stuff happening in yoga, so sometimes it's nice to ground that a little bit and get real. So yeah, I appreciate that as well. So keep doing everything that you're doing, and hope our listeners go and check out your offerings, because you have so much to offer. For everyone listening today, I hope you've enjoyed our conversation and learned something new. I hope you all have an extremely present moment. Thank you for listening. Namaste. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to the show today. Please go over to iTunes, write a review, let us know what you think. It helps us in creating new content for all of you. It also helps new listeners get a sense of what to expect from the show. We really appreciate your feedback. Thanks again for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.